It's been a great pleasure giving these lectures, and it seems appropriate for the last one to look to the future. But of course, that raises the question of how far we can predict the future, and in particular the future of philosophy. And I think it's clear that the answer is not very much, but we can still at least think about various possibilities. And I think in doing that, it's useful to make at least a rough distinction between two kinds of forces helping to determine the future of philosophy, which are often called internal and external forces. So internal forces have to do with those exerted from inside the philosophical tradition itself, whichever one is under discussion, whereas external forces are those exerted from outside the philosophical tradition. And then you can think of internal developments as those caused mainly by the internal forces, and external developments as those caused mainly by the external forces. And we're going to see lots of examples of each kind of force itself in what follows. Now, it's obvious that many developments are caused by a mixture of these forces, and the distinctions are not clear cut. It's not easy always to separate internal and external forces, but the distinctions are still useful. But just to give you an example of a case in which it's quite hard to distinguish what to count as internal and what to count as external. If you think about the role of Christianity in medieval and early modern European philosophy, at least the mainstream tradition. In some ways, you could think of that as an external force, because given the cultural and political position of Christianity, it was not really an option for most philosophers to, for example, to deny the existence of God. At least publicly. If they'd done that, it would have been the end of their career, and quite possibly the end of their lives as well. But at the same time, Christianity was not something that was completely external to philosophy, because many of the philosophical theories were, in effect, had a strong Christian element to them, and the constraints to do with the doctrine of the Trinity or whatever were to some extent internalized in philosophy. So that's a case where it would be a bit crude just to classify the role of Christianity as either an external or an internal force. But still, I think there are also some clear cases. So we can work with this distinction while acknowledging that it's not perfectly precise. So first of all, just a few words about internal developments, and I will say more later about specific ones, but just in general to begin with. So, of course, internal developments, we may think of those as that those are the ways in which philosophy ought to develop. But it's also the case that internal developments tend to be unpredictable, and in part for quite interesting reasons. So one point. I think these observations were already made by Karl Popper, for example, but that there's a kind of logical point, which is that we can't really know that we shall discover X without already knowing X, because whatever proposition X is, because if we know now that we shall discover X, that means that by implication we know now that X is true, and therefore we already know X, and so its discovery has already been made. It's not something in the future. So there's a kind of logical problem about knowing that you will know something in the future, but as we're not knowing it yet. And I mean, this is a point that, of course, that is not exclusive to philosophy. And there's a classic example of it in an interview with in his time quite well-known jazz player, jazz musician, Humphrey Lyttelton, where the interviewer asked him where is jazz going? And Humphrey Lyttelton replied, "If I knew where jazz was going, I'd be there already." So in many areas, we've got something of a phenomenon of that kind, that as soon as a phenomenon can be predicted, it happens. And I mean, you get that with the stock market, that it tends to be unpredictable unless somebody has sort of inside private information, because as soon as information is public, as soon as it becomes possible on the basis of public information to predict a change in prices, that will be priced into them already. Of course, this in part has to do with people's desire to be part of the trend, and so if you had a very pessimistic philosopher, they might think that philosophy was going in a certain direction, but they didn't want to go there. So this, in a way, this phenomenon, unlike the purely logical one, it does have to do with whether you think these changes are a good thing. But of course, on the whole, people tend to want to identify with changes in a discipline, and there's a tendency to at least to think of them as progress. There are some factors which mitigate unpredictability to some extent. So for example, in relation to the sort of logical problem of how you can predict that we will know X without already knowing X, we may be able to predict which questions will be answered, even if we cannot predict what the answer will be. So for example, in mathematics, you might predict that a certain problem will be solved within the next 20 years, because it seems like the current methods are suitable for solving a problem of that kind. But of course, if it's a real prediction, you can't already predict what the answer will be typically. You might be able to make a guess, but you're not in a position to know what the answer will be if this is a genuine prediction about some knowledge that we will gain in the future. But you might still know that problem can be solved. A sort of trivial case of that is with some very, very large number. it may not be known whether it's a prime number or not, but you might. But of course, you can predict that if people are interested, that they will within a certain time find out, because there are decision procedures. Of course, that kind of predictability doesn't seem to apply very much in philosophy, and I think it's hard even in other sciences to predict which questions will be answered. So, for example, it seems, I mean, I'm not a physicist, but it seems that the sort of research program around string theory, I mean, that was tremendously fashionable in the sort of 1980s and so on, and it seemed that physics was on the verge of all kinds of breakthroughs with string theory, but in fact, there's been a lot of stagnation where string theory has not developed in the way that it was expected to do. It hasn't, as it were, taken on a form where it's made predictions which have been verified to any large extent, and so that's an example, from physics, of a way in which it seemed that it was clear that there were going to be huge developments in that theoretical area. I mean, if you'd been predicting in 1980, presumably you'd have guessed that, but where that hasn't happened at all, and so it's very difficult in the sciences, except with, as it were, relatively routine matters, to know where breakthroughs are happening. It's not. I don't want to suggest that this is completely impossible, but it's very hard. Of course, I mean, good researchers, I mean, often have as part of their skill that they're able to distinguish which research questions are worth working on, which ones there's a good chance of being able to solve, and which there aren't. But I think it's very rarely a matter of actually knowing whether a solution can be found, but at least having a sense of which ones are promising to work on and which are not. I mean, something that we might be able to predict is more easily is intellectual decline, where knowledge is lost, or at least not gained. I mean, you might see that the kinds of the direction in which a discipline was going are likely to lead to stagnation, and may well lead to the loss of knowledge if, for example, where ancient languages are no longer studied, we may lose knowledge of these languages, and so on. So, I think in general, for the kind of reasons I've been giving, it's easier to predict the loss of knowledge than it is to predict the gain of knowledge. And I mean, that's actually something that's quite general. It's not specific to philosophy. It's not even specific to, as it were, intellectual disciplines. So, just from the point of view of everyday life, you can't predict what you're going to learn tomorrow, but you can predict a lot of what you're going to have forgotten by tomorrow. I mean, at least in the way of all sorts of trivial details. At the moment, I can see the position of various objects on my desk as I'm giving this lecture, but I won't remember those tomorrow. But those are relatively trivial examples, of course. And so those are just some remarks about the possibilities and difficulties of predicting internal developments in philosophy. I mean, I will, as I say, discuss more specific potential internal developments later in this lecture, but I wanted just to make a few remarks about the general problem of it, and then to say something now about the external forces acting on philosophy, and so the first point to make is that philosophy is not immune to external forces, even if one might think of it as something that is autonomous. There are some very clear ways in which it's not, and so if we want to start at the as it were the darkest end, if there's large-scale nuclear war or environmental collapse, those kind of factors, or as it were, even more unpredictably, a meteorite hitting the Earth or something, that they will have an effect on human civilization if they happen, and if they happen on a large enough scale, they'll have an absolutely devastating effect, and that is on human civilization, human society, and that will inevitably have an impact on philosophy. That the kind of intellectual communities that we have, they depend on certain kinds of social and even material infrastructure, which themselves depend on external forces. So those are very crude examples of the way in which we shouldn't forget about external forces in predicting the future of philosophy, because we are vulnerable to them. In certain cases, they can be decisive. And another sort of example that is, if we have populist regimes in power which are hostile to universities because they regard universities as centers of independent thought, then that will have an effect on how universities can operate, what can be said in universities, and that is likely to will almost inevitably have a negative effect on philosophy. But perhaps simply by forcing philosophers to discuss questions which are a matter of political indifference, but perhaps even more excessively than that, having philosophers who are suspected of disloyalty replaced by, as well, loyalists who are much less academically qualified, and those are the kind of things that can happen under populist regimes, and they certainly have an effect on philosophy. And I think we can see those in practice as by illustration from the history of analytic philosophy. So, I mean, it's a matter of historical record that the center of gravity of logical positivism moved west from Germany and Austria to maybe to the United States of America in the period 1933 to 45. I mean, those are the years in which Hitler was in power. I mean, the trend started, in fact, slightly earlier because of the rise of Nazism, but there was a result of the. I mean, what happened was that I mean, many of the philosophers involved in logical positivism were Jewish. Many of them were left-wing, not. I think they were not generally Marxists, but as it were, social democrats or something like that. It was impossible for them to continue under and when in a country where the Nazis were in power. I mean, some of them were, if they were Jewish, they normally lost their jobs, they were thrown out. But left wingers also were in obvious danger, and so they had to leave. A few of them went to Britain, but many more went to the USA, and so a big philosophical movement, associated with the Vienna Circle in Austria and the Berlin Circle, which was closely associated with it in the Berlin Circle in Germany, they more or less disappeared, and certain kinds of philosophy, which where German universities had been the leaders, pretty much disappeared from Germany and Austria as a result of those external political developments. And of course, this is another way in which the internal and external aspects are not completely independent here. So it wasn't just a coincidence that that many of the logical positivists were Jewish or left-wing or both. Because logical positivism was, aggressively pro-science and secular. Of course, part of the one consequence of the verification principle was that that religious language is cognitively meaningless. And so that kind of thing made it an enemy of the Roman Catholic Church, which in many European countries was closely associated with right-wing politics and anti-Semitism. And so the kind of philosophical views associated with logical positivism did also tend to put logical positivists in opposition to right-wing nationalism, and their pro-scientific attitude tended to make it a naturally internationalist movement, and so that you got those kinds of connection between the philosophical doctrines and the political ones, and those have been well documented. For example, Rudolf Carnap had close connections with the Bauhaus movement, which was not just a movement in architecture and design, but had a social aspect to it, which was associated with at least moderate left-wing politics. So again, it's not that you can completely separate the external and internal aspects of it here. There are some natural connections between them, but at the same time, this was developments in politics and culture outside the universities, which led to pretty much the eviction of logical positivism from German-speaking countries, and also had the effect of transforming philosophy in the United States. The United States became one of the main centers of analytic philosophy, and to some extent later on even dominant in analytic philosophy, as a result of the move of these Europeans, Carnap, Tarski, and many others to the United States who had a transformative effect on American philosophy. Another aspect of this, which of course I think is worth mentioning, is that colonialism has been a major factor in global philosophical developments, with the colonial power tending to impose its own intellectual traditions on its colonies. And of course, this is not by any means confined to philosophy. I mean, it applies to mathematics and natural science, and to some extent also to literature. But there were larger differences between 19th and 20th century Western colonial powers in their traditions of philosophy than in their traditions of mathematics and natural science. So it made more difference in philosophy which power colonized you. So I'm thinking less of the case of China here, which was I mean, although subject to Western colonial movement to some extent, wasn't fully colonized in the way that many countries were. But if you lived in a country where the universities would be started by the colonial power, then it made a huge difference whether the colonial power that was occupied your country was, for example, Britain or France. If you lived in a country where the colonial power was Britain, then in the philosophy department of your university, you were likely to find some kind of analytic philosophy, and whereas if the colonial power was France, you were going to find something that we can crudely call continental philosophy in the philosophy department of your local university. So as it were, those kinds of very external fact about which European country it was that colonized a given region had knock-on effects in philosophy, as as to which philosophical tradition you were, as it were, colonized by to some extent, because there are such marked differences between even between different European countries in at least their recent philosophical traditions, not so much going back in the past. And I think, I mean, obviously I'm painting with a very broad brush here, but I think it's broadly true that in the immediate post-colonial period, let's say after the end of the Second World War, post-1945, sort of cultural and linguistic ties to the colonizing power and also the inertia of tradition tended to continue the intellectual effects of colonialism, including in philosophy. So my sense is that there are quite strong differences in what kind of philosophy that you'll find in post-colonial countries, depending on which European power had colonized them, even though these countries may have been independent now for 50 or 70 years. Now, one aspect of that, which I think is also worth talking about in relation to analytic philosophy, is that a major effect has come from the growth of English as the international language of science and as the main second language in much of the world, which tending to displace, for example, French and German. And that phenomenon is one which I mean, I've seen growing even in my lifetime. So that, for example, in a country I know quite well, such as Italy, it used to be that when I first went there, that the main second languages that people would be taught after Italian would be either French or German, whereas now they're much more likely to be taught English as their second language. And so, of course, what languages you're comfortable in does make quite a large difference to what sorts of cultural and, in particular, philosophical influence you're subject to. And of course, although the language here is English, a lot of this is not so much to do with Great Britain, but with the United States. I mean, it's with its dominant economic position in the world and its cultural reach. So that's meant that English-speaking culture has had a tendency to displace the cultures associated with other Western languages, as it were. So people are watching films made in Hollywood rather than films made in France or Germany, for example. And I think that because analytic philosophy has been the dominant philosophical tradition in the English-speaking world, in this post-colonial period, analytic philosophy has tended to benefit from these trends. It's not because there's any intrinsic relation between analytic philosophy and the English language. It's just this somewhat accidental relation between, on the one hand, the analytic philosophy, and on the other hand, the geopolitical developments, which has given analytic philosophy this big advantage. I mean, of course, I think that there are all sorts of internal virtues to analytic philosophy that, as we mean that this is fundamentally a good development, but it is clearly to some extent contingent on these geopolitical developments and cultural developments, because after all, if people are not exposed to analytic philosophy, that they're not in a position to be impressed by its internal virtues. So I think we're still seeing these kinds of interaction between internal and external forces. So just to repeat, the post-1945 predominance of English as the main medium for analytic philosophy facilitates its international position, since English is currently the most international language. And I think the scientific aspect of analytic philosophy also contributes to its internationalization, since science is highly international, and of course the international language of science is English, as a result of those kind of historical events that I've been talking about. So, I think in certain respects, analytic philosophy, as it were, travels very well insofar as it's associated with science. I mean, there are aspects of it which might not travel so well. If you think about, for example, ordinary language philosophy, because the ordinary language philosophy, as it was done by, for example, in the Oxford of the 1950s and 1960s, I mean, it depended on having a very fine ear for for English. And so it was much easier for native speakers to do it than for non-native speakers, because the native speakers, as it were, it was just easier for them to pick up these very subtle distinctions in the language. And of course, it was never intended by ordinary language philosophers that English should have, as it were, some privileged position here. I mean, I don't think any of the people like Austin and Strawson and so on, I don't think any of them thought that English was intrinsically special in this case. I think their attitude was more that, well, the English is the language we know, so let's do these investigations with English. But I think, well, particularly with Strawson, you can see that that I think his expectation was that if you pursued ordinary language philosophy properly in any human natural language, you would come to broadly the same conclusions. And so in a way, it wouldn't matter very much which language you did it in, because in the end, the results would be the same, because I think he thought that what he was really uncovering was not just special features of English, but features of the way in which human beings have to think about the world in order really to make sense. But of course, it is a hypothesis that the natural languages are the same as were roughly the same as each other in this respect, and it's a hypothesis which has not infrequently been denied. But I think one thing that we might expect as analytic philosophy becomes more international and not just widespread, but as it were, with something closer to equality between different regions in which it's pursued, so that English won't be treated as the privileged language to the same extent, and that people will feel free to work with examples from their own native language, whatever it happens to be. And I think in the long run, that's got to be a good development, because I think most philosophers would agree that that we don't want to be basing, as it were, deep philosophical claims on what might turn out to be, as it were, a relatively accidental feature of English. And so one way of making a methodology more robust is by taking examples from other languages as well as English. And I mean, that is happening to some extent. I mean, I often notice, for example, German speakers using examples from German as well as from English and so on. And there's no reason why it shouldn't happen with Chinese as well. So I might just briefly mention a different strand of analytic philosophy, well, actually connected with ordinary language philosophy, although I don't think that Wittgenstein was an ordinary language philosopher in exactly the same sense as people like Austin and Strawson. But the Wittgensteinian strand of analytic philosophy, and to some extent, as it were, the strand of people who still describe themselves as ordinary language philosophers. You can also get a somewhat anti-scientific attitude there. I mean, anti-scientific not in the sense that they're against science as such, but that they're against the introduction of science into philosophy. And that's often associated with local traditions, mainly expressed in local languages. Although, of course, it's the case that Wittgenstein's influence has been highly international too. But in this kind of, as it were, specific way, and so of course one form in which, in principle, this could take would be claims that some other natural language works very, very differently from English. I have to say that my own, if you like, prejudice of a perhaps broadly Chomskyan kind is that that fundamentally the differences between different human natural languages are not very great from a philosophical point of view, that that there is something like a universal language faculty that's part of the innate inheritance of human beings, and that is related to the shared cognitive faculties that we have more generally, and that the most of the really interesting features of natural language from a philosophical point of view are tapping into this in one way or another, although the way these are expressed in different languages may differ. But of course, that is to some extent a hypothesis which needs to be tested and is being tested. So one more specific point is that it's particularly the formal areas of analytic philosophy that facilitate internationalization, because sophistication in English plays a less significant role. And as it were, once we get really technical, then the formulas can do the talking. And this is something, of course, that happens a lot in mathematics and mathematical areas of the natural sciences, that as well, the main communication is through the formulas, and so it doesn't really matter what levels of skill in English beyond, as well, working minimum people have. So I think as well, formal areas are somewhat easier to internationalize than the more discursive areas, and of course, I think this kind of internationalization is something that can be observed. I mean, since the 1980s, which is, I started as a professional philosopher, having done my doctorate in 1980, that one of the most obvious global philosophical trends has been the spread of analytic philosophy. So in 1980, it was still mainly in English-speaking countries with just little outposts here and there outside, and now it's a very much more global movement than then. And of course, I'm aware that in China it's still only a minority interest, but my very strong impression is that there are many more analytic philosophers in China today than there were 30 years ago, and I think the scientific side, of course, of the analytic philosophy in China is benefiting from the internationalization of Chinese science in general. And as I've already suggested, within analytic philosophy, the English-speaking world is much less dominant than before. And so, for example, if we take the case of formal epistemology, which is definitely a hardcore analytic philosophy, it's often regarded as a European speciality. I mean, that's to say, it's the center of gravity of formal epistemology. It, may well now be in Europe, not in North America. Of course, there's plenty of formal epistemology going on there too, but I think some of the most distinctive centers of it, I mean, for example, in Amsterdam and Munich and I trust in Oxford are in Europe, not in North America. And I mean, so looking to the future, that's where the relative decline in the economic and cultural dominance on the part of the United States is likely to have knock-on effects in philosophy in the kinds of ways that we've seen. I mean, international influence does in part have to do with the competition for scarce resources and in terms of jobs and places on PhD programs and all these kind of things. So we can't totally separate these trends. That as it were, countries which are rich enough to have lots of scholarships, which are open to international competition, that gives them an advantage in international influence, and to have that advantage depends on the economic position of the country that they're in, that's funding these positions. I certainly think that the spread of analytic philosophy through many countries makes it intellectually more robust than when confined to a few countries. I mean, it makes it less vulnerable to local trends, and those include both internal and external factors. So it's less, I mean, vulnerable to external factors because, for example, by contrast with logical positivism, which was extremely vulnerable because it was so concentrated in German-speaking countries. I mean, fortunately, the relevant people managed to escape rather than getting executed, but that was just a matter of exactly how the politics played out, and so a contemporary example will be that there are cultural and political trends, for example, in the United States, such as culture wars between a kind of rough, very crudely speaking, a nationalistic, anti-intellectual, anti-scientific right, and a sort of very inward-looking, parochially politically correct, or as people might say, woke left. And those kind of culture wars have had some effect on analytic philosophy in America, in that, as it were, issues in the whether what people's attitudes are to matters of identity politics and so on, and so I mean, and that kind of politicization, I mean, it can have good aspects in the way that people are thinking about important new issues, but it can also have damaging aspects where certain views are not allowed to be defended because they're treated as were politically incorrect. And I think the internationalization of analytic philosophy means that it's a bit less vulnerable to those kind of national trends, because there will be other countries where it's being done where the national trends are different, and so as it were, it's not that it's less likely that certain ideas can simply be totally silenced by a trend in some particular country or a particular small group of countries. So I think, as it were, those kinds of external circumstances that I've been sketching in the last few minutes are propitious for the further growth of the scientific end of analytic philosophy, which using formal methods and including model building and so on, the kind of thing that I've been discussing in some of these lectures. I think that, as it were, that sort of style of scientific analytic philosophy, which I have generally been explaining and defending in these lectures, is very well suited to internationalization. And I don't think we're going to see a return to logical positivism, because logical positivism was associated with originally with rather simple-minded conceptions of science, which I think are now generally seen as inadequate. That, as it were, conceptions of science where you that would not be acceptable, in a department of history and philosophy of science, for example, simply because they're so distant from the way that science is actually practiced. And I think a lot of the, as it were, the force behind the verification principle of the logical positivists was based on the idea that it was just an application of scientific standards, but science itself has turned out to be much richer and more complicated and more varied than the as it were, the logical positivists' positive stereotype of it suggested. So I don't see that there'll be a return to logical positivism, at least in any very crude form. Although there are, you might feel there are aspects of logical positivism in the way that the influence of philosophers such as Carnap sometimes plays out with still with a rather crude distinction between roughly speaking, the empirical and the conceptual, which I was also criticizing in earlier lectures. So I've been talking about the stereotypically scientific side of analytic philosophy, but I think that another area where analytic philosophy, I think, has the ability to thrive internationally is in analytic moral and political philosophy and applied ethics, because, and this is a point that I think made before, that they have a distinctive ability and willingness to talk clearly and directly about questions of value, which, as I think I mentioned previously in a previous lecture, those are questions which, as it were, many people in the social sciences want to talk about, but that they feel inhibited from talking about them because they want to be doing a social science, and they think that a necessary condition for that is having a value-free discourse. Whereas one of the advantages of the kind of discourse that you get with analytic moral and political philosophy and applied ethics is that it is absolutely openly evaluative, and that, as it would, in a very direct way, so that it enables people to talk about the the moral and political questions that they want to address. And I think that gives it an advantage which it is not so dependent on any particular national culture, but as it were, an advantage which comes from the fact that as it were, the sort of the idea of value-free social science is very widespread, but it that leaves space for something else which is not value-free at all, but explicitly addresses the questions of value that most of us are interested in. I mean, not exclusively interested in, but certainly are interested in. Of course, I mean, this, as we're explicitly evaluative feature of analytic moral and political philosophy also makes it more controversial. And so it can come under religious or political pressure. And so, for example, an analytic moral philosopher such as Peter Singer, with his distinctive views on euthanasia and other things. I mean, he has come under. I mean, he's a very controversial figure outside philosophy as well. A different feature is that I think we can expect the links between analytic philosophy and cognitive psychology, artificial intelligence, and so on, to become even stronger, because I think it's pretty clear that that those disciplines are likely, in the next 50 years to have some transformative effect on our self-understanding. It may be harder for reasons that I explained at the beginning. It's harder to predict just what the effect will be, but I think that the kind of questions that those subjects are making progress with have to do with pretty central issues about, as well, how the human mind works, which are certainly relevant to philosophical questions. I mean, they may not be, strictly speaking, philosophical questions. They may be, strictly speaking, questions that have to do with things like human psychology. But at the same time, they are, because they do have to do with human psychology, they are transforming our conception of ourselves to some extent, and how we think of ourselves is bound to be relevant to a lot of what happens in philosophy too. What our view is of this, as it were, the I who is thinking about these philosophical questions, for reasons which are related to things I mentioned in talking about the model building methodology. I mean, these kind of connections are relevant not only to philosophy of mind, where it's very obvious what their relevance is, but also to epistemology, because epistemology, as where its number one interest is in specifically human knowledge. It's not exclusively interested in it, but that is still the dominant interest. And so epistemological theories, which just are completely fail to fit the emerging picture of the human mind that we get from cognitive psychology. I mean, they I think are in trouble. For similar reasons, philosophy of language it is primarily, although not exclusively, philosophy of human language, and so that developments in the cognitive psychology of language have got to be important there. And I mean, because they also, for example, bear on how it is that we can evaluate sentences of natural language, what's going on cognitively there, which is, I think, is very relevant even to the status of the kind of evidence that we have in the philosophy of language and semantics. Philosophy of action, of course, is primarily philosophy of human action. Philosophy of art is primarily the philosophy of human art, and so on. So I think in all those cases, as we transform our understanding of ourselves in the light of developments in cognitive psychology and AI, which I think to some degree is inevitable, there will be all sorts of knock-on effects about for all these branches of philosophy, which, as it were, are primarily, although not exclusively, to do with the human. And it may be difficult to know exactly what the transformations will be, but something would be going wrong, I think, if we didn't learn quite a bit from what cognitive psychology is finding out about these matters. Of course, that raises the question of whether analytic philosophy will simply become absorbed into cognitive science. But I don't think that's likely, because I think it has too many features which cognitive science will not fully adopt. So there's the kind of central role of logic, where not simply in thinking about human reasoning, which of course is cognitive science, but in logic, just reasoning deductively, to I think a larger extent than you tend to get with cognitive science. And I think another aspect which is likely to remain foreign to cognitive science is the fact that I was talking about a few minutes ago, that in moral and political philosophy and applied ethics, analytic philosophers are explicitly normative. I think also the role of thought experiments is likely to be somewhat different in philosophy and in cognitive psychology. So I think we're to some extent going to retain our independence. And so, for example, an area where we won't, I think, be absorbed is metaphysics. I mean, of course, cognitive psychology is interested in, if you like, folk metaphysics, the way that humans are sort of innately disposed to think about issues of, for example, the identity of physical objects and that sort of thing. But metaphysics isn't concerned with to study human thinking about the nature of reality. It's simply concerned to study the nature of reality itself. And cognitive psychology is not equipped to substitute for metaphysics in that sense. Of course, I don't want to suggest that as it were, that analytic philosophy is just going to become to achieve any kind of unchallenged dominance. I think that's very unlikely. And as we're just at the popular level, apart from other traditions, as we're within the academy, at the popular level, I think there will continue to be anti-analytic popular philosophy. Because it will give people sort of easier and cheaper gratification, and it'll in effect tell people what they want to hear, and it will. And I think it certainly, if analytic philosophy becomes, the more scientific it becomes, the more there will also be people, as well, popular or populist philosophers, telling their readers or listeners that they don't need to bother with that kind of scientific philosophy because it's just arid and sterile and is not dealing with any of the deeper questions. So I think that kind of critique of philosophy particularly of analytic philosophy and particularly of its scientific side. I think that is very unlikely ever to go away, because as well, there's a popular impression that philosophy should be, very, very deep and yet quite easy to understand, which is, as it were, just a form of wishful thinking. But I don't think we're ever going to get to a stage where human beings are not subject to wishful thinking. On the question of language, as far as I can see, there's no sign of English ceasing to be the international language of science. That's so even though English-speaking countries are to some extent, well, in particular the United States, losing their dominant position in the world from an economic and political and military point of view. And I think an analogy to consider is with Latin, which remained the international language of scholarship, as it were, of science in the way it was understood in the Middle Ages. Of course, originally it got its position, but because of its role in the Roman Empire, particularly the Western Roman Empire. But it retained that position for 1,000 years after the Roman Empire fell, even though it, as it were, it gradually became quite a separate language from anyone's native language, even the native language of people in Italy, but it just, as it were, by default, remained the international language of scholarship. It was, if you wanted to engage in serious scholarship, you had to know Latin, whatever country you came from. And I guess, as well, the fact that it wasn't associated with any one country also gave it a kind of neutrality that, in a way, it was a slightly better feature than English has. And so that, as it were, it simply remained the international language because there was no great pressure to change. Of course, eventually it did lose this position, but I think that as it were, if there is a further decline in the position of it globally, politically, economically, of English-speaking countries, it does not mean that English will cease to be the international language of science. Of course, it's probably not going to be that forever, but it may be that for the foreseeable future. And of course, the global role of English poesy is a difficult choice for non-native speakers of English, whether to write or speak in English for a global readership or audience, or to write or speak in their native language for a more local readership or audience. With, on the one hand, the advantages of fluency on the side of the native language, and the advantages of a wider reach on the side of English. Yeah, sorry, there's a mistake. One can typically publish more easily locally than internationally, that should say. But one can typically express oneself with more nuance and subtlety in one's native language. And I think there's also, a very laudable wish to preserve and develop the resources of a local language or culture or tradition, so that, as it were, people want their native language to be one which is capable of expressing the most difficult and sophisticated ideas, and so they don't want it to, as it were, just somehow lapse into being the language of for non-intellectual, non-scientific standards. But I think it's also, of course, true that local publishing can just be a kind of comfort zone where international standards are not enforced, so that, as it were, it's just easier to publish in one's local language because the standards are not so high. And so that divide also makes it easier for tensions to arise between a sort of globalized scientific philosophy, typically in English, and more localized humanistic activity in history, literature, language, and culture. And so that kind of more localized humanistic activity in the humanities is likely to involve localized philosophy too, and typically, again, in the local language. Which, as well, because of its affiliation with these local humanistic activities in other disciplines, is likely to be in a more historical or literary style, and it's likely to be anti-analytic because it sees analytic philosophy as a threat of globalization. So that this kind of contrast between scientific and humanistic philosophy, I don't think it's just as it were, an accidental feature of the division between so-called analytic and continental philosophy, maybe that which had to do with various political developments, not simply philosophical ones. I think it does have these deeper roots in the, as it were, the conflict between localizing and globalizing forces. But it's not a completely straightforward opposition. And I mean, the economist Amartya Sen made this point nicely by saying that the best example of globalization is the anti-globalization movement, which, I mean, the anti-globalization movement is itself a global movement. And of course, nationalism can be an international trend. I mean, in Europe in the 19th century, I mean, nationalism certainly was an international trend. Of course, exactly how this will interact with political developments is hard to say, because in the West, localizing trends in philosophy have tended not to be associated with political nationalism, which in its current forms tend to be anti-intellectual. But I mean, of course, those could change. But at the moment, that those two trends, I mean, as it were, localizing trend in philosophy and nationalism in politics, they're not, as far as I can see, allied. Even though they have certain similarities. In fact, instead, a recent trend in Western philosophy has been a growing interest in non-Western philosophical traditions. Actually, in calling them non-Western, in some cases, that's a slightly questionable characterization. But certainly, philosophical traditions which are not, which haven't been very present in recent Western philosophy, are now attracting much more interest, and these include Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, Islamic philosophy, although of course Islamic and Jewish philosophy, although in fact Islamic philosophy and Jewish philosophy, they both fed into the Western tradition, so as it were, a lot of ancient Greek philosophy was passed into Western European philosophy through the influence of Islamic and Jewish philosophy. They played a crucial mediating role for scholastic philosophy. Then Africana philosophy, Latin American philosophy, and indigenous American philosophy, and others as well, and I think certainly the trend in in many Western countries is to take these forms of philosophy much more seriously than, whereas previously they'd been more or less totally ignored. And it's not surprising that we have a trend like that, because we're dealing with increasingly multicultural societies, and so many of the students in universities come from different backgrounds, and they're likely to be more motivated by philosophical, to see, as we're represented on the curriculum, philosophical traditions which are related to their own ethnic origins. Now, I mean, much of the interest in these other traditions has been historical, with the idea that there's no good reason to confine the history of philosophy taught in philosophy departments to the tradition going back to classical Greece. Although, as I mentioned, if you actually follow the tradition from contemporary Western philosophy to ancient Greek philosophy, you see that it in fact does go via Islamic philosophy and Jewish philosophy, but they somehow got left out. And there's also a similar movement, but all of which are, as it were, related in some way to the development of identity politics, but for including more work by women philosophers in the Western tradition. And so, on the one hand, there's a lot of historical work of finding, as it were, reviving interest in women philosophers who are often, quite well-known figures in their own time, but then left out of the canon of works studied, and now there's a movement to include them. Of course, as I noted in lecture 7, there's competition for scarce resources here, so that if you include one thing in the curriculum, that normally involves excluding it makes a difference here whether we're talking about countries in which the dominant mode of philosophical education has been simply education in the history of philosophy. And then, of course, there's a question about why it should be one tradition rather than another that gets taught. But there's also a question about how this bears on, as it were, first level philosophical questions of a non-historical kind. And when the treatment of these other traditions or neglected philosophers, in the case of women, for example, there's also a movement towards making this philosophy come alive philosophically by treating it in less historical, sort of literary and philological ways, and instead engaging with it as philosophy. Because it wouldn't be very interesting, for example, to have a lot of study of Chinese philosophy for Western students if most of what they were reading was just discussion about the meaning of certain words in Chinese and so on, and very detailed scholarly questions about this. It's got to if it's going to come alive for them, it needs to be presented in a way so that it speaks to their philosophical interests. And so needs to be not dominated by historical and linguistic questions. However, I mean, of course, from a scholarly point of view, those questions are very important. But if they're given too much prominence in the way it's taught, then it's not going to be successful with students. And of course, sometimes the result of just getting past these historical and linguistic questions and looking at what is really being said is that what had originally looked like a very exotic and other philosophy turns out to be, in its ideas, much more similar to what we're used to than it had been presented as being by scholars. So my impression is, for example, with Indian philosophy, that's happening, that as it were, the stereotype of Indian philosophy was as something mystical or something like that, as it were, the wisdom of the East, and something that was intuitive rather than rational or something, But when you actually look at it, you find that it in fact speaks to many of the questions that analytic philosophers are interested in, for example, in the area of epistemology. So that as it were, traditions which may have evolved in quite other parts of the world with very little interaction between them, or perhaps hardly any between them and Western philosophy, that they may in fact share common themes, but because after all, these are all forms of philosophy produced by human beings with pretty much the same cognitive capacities that are universal to our species, and that may have more influence on the kind of philosophical questions that we ask than you might think. That we shouldn't think that, as it were, that philosophy. I mean, of course, philosophy depends to some extent on the culture in which it develops, but there may also be this, as it were, a basic human aspect to it, which renders it in many cases much more intelligible than one might have expected, and less alien. I mean, so I've been talking about all sorts of trends, or to put it slightly disparagingly, intellectual fashions, but I don't think we should expect philosophy to change too fast. I mean, as it were, the things that are being talked about in blogs and on Twitter may change quickly, but maybe less so in what actually happens in philosophy departments. Because in all intellectual traditions, there are strong forces of inertia, because, put it very crudely, philosophers and other academics often teach into their 60s ideas that they learned as PhD students in their 20s. So, as it were, once they've started their career investing heavily in a certain tradition, they're not very likely, and perhaps not even very able, to change. And I mean, the phrase "you can't teach an old dog new tricks" in English really sums that up. And as it were, I'm reminded of one explanation which some historians have offered for why peasant societies tend to be very conservative, that the children in peasant societies, children are looked after by their grandparents while their parents work in the fields, and so, as it were, what gets passed on it's from two generations back, not just from one. And of course, in universities, people are often supervised by professors, who are the age of their grandparents. So there's, as it were, that kind of phenomenon, even in academic life, as well as in peasant societies. So I want to close with a few further remarks about these possibilities for the future. So one obvious point to make is that innovation is easier in an expanding university system. I mean, just to take an example that might not immediately come to mind, at the end of the First World War, when Poland became an independent country, there was a huge expansion in its university system, and there were some very far-sighted Polish intellectuals and academics who were involved in setting that up, and they targeted certain areas where they decided Poland was going to be world class. I mean, they realized that Poland was too small and to be world class and everything, but they targeted certain areas, and one of the areas that they targeted was logic. And I mean, because of course they had some existing strength there, but they put a lot of resources into logic, and that farsightedness was, I think, vindicated by the tremendous growth of logic in Poland, and it produced Alfred Tarski, who's one of the greatest logicians of all time. Of course, it was all then destroyed in the Second World War, or largely destroyed. But that was an example of where new developments were made possible, but in large part because the university system was expanding. So for people who knew how to take advantage of that, there were possibilities of making appointments in the right area. And of course, China is another case with an expanding university system, which does have similar possibilities open to it. And well, it's silly in a way for me to be lecturing you about China, since you know much more about it than I do. But it's obviously the case that China's increasing international role and heavy investment in education and research give it the opportunity to play an increasingly influential role in international philosophy. I think less with traditional Chinese philosophy, although that certainly will be studied internationally. But I'm not talking so much about that as about the development of first order philosophy. And I think that there's certainly a room for lots of direct contributions from China to research in analytic philosophy. And I think one can see that kind of active role already starting in logic, where partly for reasons that I've been explaining, there are fewer cultural obstacles. But I certainly don't think that this future trend should be confined to logic. I think it's there are all sorts of possibilities for it in analytic philosophy much more generally. And as it were, to put it in crudely economic terms, China has the capacity to become a net exporter of ideas if advantage is taken in the right way of the kind of opportunities that are available. And of course, one thing that's required for China to become a net exporter of ideas is that innovation and creativity have to be encouraged, or at least not discouraged in the young. So it's got to be that the young scholars are rewarded for new ideas, and even when they're critical of their professors' ideas, they've got to be allowed to do that. They mustn't be, as it were, get into trouble just because they're criticizing their professors' ideas. I mean, speaking for myself, I would much rather have students who disagree with me in interesting ways than ones who agree with me in boring ways. And so just to put it very crudely, that the job of each generation is is not to follow the previous generation, it's to do better than the previous generation. I mean, of course, often by building on what the previous generation has done, but sometimes by correcting the mistakes of the previous generation. So that's the end of the last lecture, and thank you very much for following.
Thank you, Professor Williamson, for your very interesting and very flourished lecture. Could I share my screen now? Could you see that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Actually, so I agreed with Professor Williamson in an interesting way, rather than disagreed with you. And for many points you made in the lectures, I don't think I would disagree with you, but I would say some other things about your lecture tonight. So I divided your lecture into 3 parts. So in first part about internal and external forces acting on philosophy. So on slide 3, number 3, you mentioned that many developments are caused by the mixture forces. So here I just want to mention that you have said in the previous lectures, philosophy is a science which strives to be as systematic, as rigorous, as precise, as accurate, as critical, and as evidence-based as its questions permit, to use the best methods available to answer them. Here I agree with you that some external forces have acted on philosophy, as Russell's description of the history of Western philosophy with association of changes in societies and times. However, I think any external fact could not determine the development of philosophy in the past and in the future. Even if there is such fact, the internal facts should be the decisions ones in the development of philosophy. By the way, it's a highly controversial for decades on whether there is any development in philosophy in a strict sense. I've not been involved into debate, but concerned with how to evaluate the development, if any. So I would like to say that there should be a clear-cut distinction between the internal and external facts in the development of philosophy. For the internal facts should be the decisive. Of course, here, so I use the term factor rather than force, just because I just want to mention that some external or internal forces should be viewed as factors rather than forces on the development of philosophy. And on page 20, you mentioned that philosophy is not immune to external forces. Yes, you mentioned the 2 forces that they are the Second World War and colonialism in philosophy after the war. Here, let me take Chinese philosophy as an example. As we know, philosophy as discipline in China came from the West. Chinese philosophy is a mixture of framework of Western philosophy with traditional Chinese culture, such as Confucian, classicals, history, and literature. But I don't think that Chinese philosophy is a result of colonial or colonization of Western philosophy to China. It came from self-consciousness of Chinese scholars who attempted to distinct Western philosophy from traditional Chinese Confucianism, which was viewed as old-fashioned or unfertile. In this sense, Western philosophy was introduced into China with Chinese scholars' initiative and active efforts. In the second part, you mentioned on page 23, language and formalization in analytical philosophy. Formal areas of analytical philosophy facilitated internationalization because sophistication in English plays less significant role. Yes, it is true that English is currently an international language, both in scientific and philosophical fields. As we know, however, the initial language in the origin of analytical philosophy was German, not English. It's also true that English has been dominated in contemporary Western philosophy because of the growth of the United States of America. But the formalization in analytical philosophy has been flourished, particularly in European countries, as Poland, the Netherlands, and Britain. You mentioned this point in your lecture. In my opinion, analytical philosophy is not bound to English. It's quite coincidental for English to be dominated in analytical philosophy. And you mentioned analytical philosophy in China. Here, I just want to say it's an apt evaluation of current situation of analytical philosophy in China. We have a society for analytical philosophy affiliated in Chinese Society for Contemporary Foreign Philosophy, which organized national conferences every 2 years since 2005. The 12th national conference will be held in Chongqing next month. We also have Chinese Wittgenstein Society, Pragmatic Society, and Society for Theory of Knowledge, all of which focused on analytical approach to philosophy. Each society has organized conferences, seminars, and colloquia every year. The number of publications in analytical philosophy has been increasing for decades. Some scholars have published their papers in English in international journals. Comparing with phenomenology in China, however, analytical philosophy is not very prevalently popular in philosophical circle in China because of its technical skill in logic. So it's difficult to most of Chinese philosophers to argue with logical formulation. In your lecture, you mentioned the relation of analytical philosophy with the cognitive science. Here, as I just want to mention that philosophy is attributed to cognitive science with its analytical approach. So, cognitive science is defined in Stanford in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy as an interdisciplinary study of mind and intelligence, embracing philosophy, psychology, artificial intelligence, neuroscience, linguistics, and anthropology. Thus, analytical philosophy is acceptable and arguably a part of cognitive science. Of course, there are some features which cognitive science will not fully adopt, as you mentioned, but not attributed to cognitive science, not because of their philosophical significance, but of their sort of experiment and observation in experience. In the third part, you mentioned the globalization and localization. On page 42, you mentioned the tension between them can easily arise between globalized scientific philosophy and more localized humanistic analytical activity in history, literature, language, culture, and so on. You also mentioned that the latter is likely to involve localized philosophy too, which may be in a more historical or literary style and is like to be anti-analytical because it seems analytical philosophy as a threat. I think it's worth to be noting that localization of philosophy has been illuminated in the philosophy in Chinese language, which is called in Chinese Hanyu 哲学. The philosophy is not part of Chinese traditional philosophy, such as Confucianism or Taoism, but contemporary philosophy written in Chinese modern language. It is an attempt to localize philosophy in Chinese language. It drives philosophical researches in China into much general conceptions on Chinese characters. This philosophy could be an example of the other philosophy from perspective of Western philosophy. However, other philosophy, this term, other philosophy or non-Western philosophy, is referring to philosophies out of West. It also has a sense of Western centralism. You may say, or we could say that the term is used in much geographical than political sense. But it would make some misunderstanding to use such a term, I think, no matter in which sense, just as when we use the term non-Chinese philosophy as a term, sometimes we also use non-Chinese philosophy to show us some very comfort or self-confirmation. Finally, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Tim Williamson for his good wishes to Chinese analytical philosophy in his concluding remarks. It's very important for Chinese philosophers to be more innovative and creative in our philosophical researches. In order to get this goal, we need more international exchange in philosophy and in academia in general. And finally, I would like to raise 3 questions for Professor Williamson. Number 1, you mentioned that the global positivism was aggressively pro-science and secular on page 17. I wonder why you associated the philosophy of logical positivism with politicals in the 1920s. So do you think that the anti-Semitism was the cause of the escape of members of logical positivism from Europe to other countries? Number 2, you mentioned the anti-scientific Wittgensteinian strength of analytical philosophy on page 22. So actually, you have explained the meaning or the things of the term, the anti-scientifical in your lecture. So, but because I prepare my question before your lecture, so I just want to know in further about why do you think Wittgenstein's, or we could say the later Wittgenstein's philosophy could be called anti-scientifical. The last one, you mentioned the continuity of anti-analytical popular philosophy as one of further trend. It is true that there has been a debate between analytical and anti-analytical philosophers. I would like to want to know, how do you react to the anti-analytical popular philosophers when you meet them? And how could we do if we need to argue for an analytical approach to philosophy? Last but not least, I would like to thank Professor Tim Williamson very much for your substantial and inspiring series lectures, especially to Chinese audience. It reminds me of Bertrand Russell's series lecture in China in 1920. Russell brought logic and knowledge to China a century ago, and you brought thought and philosophy to China in 2020. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to Professor Williamson and Chen Bo for the great series of talks. I have actually put out a questionnaire to gather questions that the audience want to be presented to Professor Williamson about the future of philosophy. The first two sets of questions are mainly based on the answers to the questionnaire. So the first question is about the future of experimental philosophy. Experimental philosophy attempted to challenge traditional method in analytical philosophy, just as analytical philosophy attempted to challenge its predecessors. The question is, will X field be able to establish itself as a major philosophical trend, just as analytical philosophy did before? Or less optimistically, experimental philosophy won't achieve the status of analytical philosophy and will only become a not so major interdisciplinary research field in philosophy and cognitive science. This is the first question. And the second question is about philosophical methods and development of new technology and new methods in natural science and social sciences. Professor Williamson mentioned links with cognitive psychology, AI, etc. will become even stronger because those disciplines are likely to transform our self-understanding. But actually, what kind of role can new technology, such as virtual reality, play in philosophy education? For instance, would it be possible and desirable to use virtual reality to experience what it's like to be a brain in the vat, or what it is like to be in the cave, just as Plato has described? What would it be helpful in philosophy education? In addition, will statistical and computational methods, computer simulation, become more useful and prevalent in philosophy, and how? This is the second set of questions. The third question is about the philosophical mechanics and dynamics. Professor Williamson has used some mechanistic terms such as forces, for example, internal and external forces, and the inertia to describe the movement or development of philosophy. The question is, could we be more exact and informative about those forces while constructing a history of philosophy retrospectively and work out a rough future trajectory if we gather enough information about the forces? Because some people who specialize in the history of philosophy do believe there is some kind of law or logic in the development of history of philosophy. So what's your opinion about this position? The fourth question is about how do we combine philosophical methods of thought experiments, computational methods, and the natural and social sciences? Because Thought experiments use imagination to construct or design possible scenarios and cases. However, what is easy for one to imagine is difficult for another. Actual knowledge in empirical and mathematical science might boost imagination so as to improve the capacity to philosophize. So the question is, could you think of a way to design a hybrid method of philosophizing that combines both thought experiments and actual experiments in the sciences? In addition, now we mainly use our prolific, old good-fashioned brains and pencils, keyboards, and armchairs to philosophize. How could computational methods come to our assistance, just as it has happened in other areas of research? The fifth and final question is, where will the next revolutionary ideas of philosophy be produced? Historically, revolutionary ideas in philosophy did not always come from the established institutions of philosophy. And sometimes the established institution of philosophy is some kind of anti-revolutionary to philosophy. For example, Descartes, Hume, Rousseau, or even Helmholtz, they actually played a anti-role to the established institution to be creative in philosophical ideas. So the question is, will it be produced in the current and established institution of philosophy, the philosophy departments in the universities, or can it also appear in other research areas, such as politics, the arts, and the mathematical and natural sciences, or AI? For those disciplines can become more and more self-reflective and philosophical. So those people who specialize in other areas will become the revolutionary philosophers, not we, the philosophers who actually worked in the philosophical institutions, who actually become the status quo. And this is it. And finally, I want to thank Professor Williamson and for the great talks, and Professor Chen for meticulously organizing the great event. And I also want to, especially want to thank Professor Williamson and Professor Chen for the encouragement to the younger generation of Chinese philosophers. Thanks.
So many thanks to Zhang Yi and Li Zhongwei for their kind words and for their interesting questions. And just so that I remember to say it now, and thanks so much to Chen Bo for setting up these lectures and organizing them. And it's been a great privilege for me to interact with so many interesting philosophers in China and to see how things are developing here. It's really been a great experience. So now I should say something in response to the questions that both the interlocutor and the question have been raising. And so to begin with Zhang Yi's comments. So he said that internal factors should be the decisive ones in the development of philosophy, and that there should be a clear-cut distinction between internal and external factors. And I can agree with that to a large extent. If should be just is prescriptive rather than descriptive. If that's a comment on how things ought to be. So that, but I think it's that with some of the examples that I gave, like the role of Christianity, as something which had cultural hegemony, but was also to some extent internalized into philosophy. That it is quite, in practice, it is actually hard to draw a clear-cut distinction, and and I mean, sometimes, of course, the interference of the external is just very clearly bad. I mean, an example of that, a famous example, of course, in biology is the role of the semi-fraudulent Lysenko under Stalin, but it's also the case that when we come to philosophy, we do come with a whole cultural background, which is formed in various ways that are external to philosophy, and it's hard to believe that philosophy would be better if we somehow came to it without most of that cultural background, whatever it is, and it seems that philosophy is likely to gain by having people participating in it with differing cultural backgrounds, rather than all of that just simply being eliminated before we even entered, as were the philosophy seminar room. So I suspect that we need a more subtle way of talking about what is, to some extent, this very recognizable feature of the internal and the external, but a feature which becomes harder to as it were to trace as we start thinking about how in practice we might try to classify things. So I completely, of course, I accept what Jaggi was saying, that the introduction of Western philosophy in China was something, as it were, was an active move by Chinese philosophers. That was not something imposed from the West, and of course, China was not colonized in this to the extent that many. I mean, the countries in Africa and the Americas were, but of course, even there, I mean, even the introduction of Western philosophy, that required the decisive external factors such as the ability to communicate with the West, so that it was even an option to introduce it. I also, of course, completely agree that the connection between analytic philosophy and English is coincidental, and it's just, as it were, it's a historical accident which happened sometime after the beginning of analytic philosophy, and I think in principle, analytic philosophy can be done in any natural language. Of course, in any language, you need to develop some specialized vocabulary for doing analytic philosophy. So I've been involved in a project in the 1990s to develop the vocabulary for analytic philosophy in Portuguese. I mean, which of course a Western European language, but that was that involved a group of Portuguese philosophers producing a kind of glossary or almost an encyclopedia of philosophy to establish a common vocabulary for the technical terms in analytic philosophy, so that, but I think, I mean, so it's really any language, as it were, needs a certain amount of adaptation just at the level of technical terms to be suitable for analytic philosophy. And it also, I mean, requires certain kinds of certain relation to, as it were, rhetorical norms, which often are associated with different languages. I mean, for example, in English, the rhetorical norms are very different from other European languages in that, and this is not an intrinsic feature of the English language, but just something about the perhaps mainly British tradition, that there's an emphasis on using concrete words rather than abstract words, and simple sentences rather than complex sentences, and the coordinate clauses rather than subordinate clauses. And so those are different. Those are just, again, accidentally, those are features of the way in which people are taught to write good English, which are actually quite conducive to analytic philosophy and are different from what people are taught, with other European languages. I mean, there's nothing intrinsically, no intrinsic connection with English, but different languages are associated with different rhetorical traditions, and it's clear that that some of those traditions are more to analytic philosophy than others. So on the connection between the analytic philosophy and cognitive science, I think that the definition that was being quoted of cognitive science, which mentioned it as an interdisciplinary inquiry, that where one of the relevant disciplines was philosophy. I mean, of course, I am accepting that definition, but I don't think the intention of the definition was to say that all philosophy is part of cognitive science. I mean, that as well, a lot of philosophy is relevant to cognitive science, but that doesn't mean that philosophy is just absorbed into cognitive science. After all, cognitive science uses mathematics, but I don't think that we would regard mathematics as a branch of cognitive science. And I mentioned metaphysics as a particular branch of philosophy, which I think is very clearly not part of cognitive science. Now, on the Zheng has three very specific questions as well, which I should answer. So the first of them was about the role of anti-Semitism in the flight of logical positivism from Nazi-controlled Europe, and I think that is a matter of historical record. So from the Vienna Circle, three who left, primarily because they were Jewish, were Friedrich Weissmann, Otto Neurath, and Herbert Feigl. I think there were others. And then, as it were, for people more loosely associated with the logical positivist movement, I mean, two very big figures would be who were Jewish, partly Jewish, were Alfred Tarski and Hans Reichenbach. So I think there were many cases where people had to leave because they were Jewish, and you know, you would lose your job in the German system from being, if you were Jewish. I mean, university system, and that happened to Husserl, of course, not in the strict narrow sense an analytic philosopher. And I think it was also the case that logical positivism was actually classified by the Nazis as a Jewish movement in philosophy, even though, of course, many of the leading logical positivists were not Jewish, like Carnap and Morris Schlick and so on. But so I think the connection with anti-Semitism is well documented. Then on my description of Wittgenstein as anti-scientific, so as I mentioned, it was not that Wittgenstein thought that the natural sciences or mathematics, that they were bad in themselves. He respected them, but I think he was anti-scientific about philosophical method, and so that partly had to do with I think his attitude that that specific results of in mathematics and the natural sciences were not themselves of any particular philosophical interest. They didn't, as it were, they didn't cast light on philosophical matters. A notorious example of this was his attitude to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, where his view was that they should be treated as whether they would simply, some more theorems of mathematics. That if we somehow thought that their actual content had specific philosophical relevance, for example, to the philosophy of mathematics or something like that, then we were making some kind of philosophical mistake. And so in that sense, he was anti-scientific, and I think that the kind of rigor that I've been pushing in philosophy, I think he would have regarded that as a mistaken assimilation of philosophy to science, and would be very hostile to it. And as it were, if philosophy is really, as he uses his famous metaphor, showing the fly out of the way out of the fly bottle, then that is not the kind of thing that the natural sciences or mathematics are doing, and so it would be a mistake to try to, as it were, to give the fly a lecture on science in order to help it out. Something, on his view, something more practical was needed. And so in that sense, I think he was anti-scientific about philosophical method. And then the final question was a slightly tongue-in-cheek question about, so how do I argue for the analytic approach? And what do I say when I meet anti-analytic populist philosophers? Well, one way in which I can at least, I think, manage to irritate anti-analytic populist philosophers in the British context is that in the campaign for Brexit, notoriously, the government minister Michael Gove said, this was in fact in relation to economics, that I think people have had enough of experts, and so I think one point I like to make to populist philosophers is that in effect that their attitude is as it were the equivalent of Michael Gove's attitude, as that they think that in philosophy we've had enough of experts, and as it were it should be done by non-experts. And given how unpopular Michael Gove tends to be with philosophers, that as it were, at least is somewhat rhetorically effective. I think one just has to try to explain that although philosophical, one can maybe relatively easy to ask philosophical questions, but the fact that a question is easy to ask doesn't mean that it's easy to answer. But I don't think that there is any guaranteed way of changing the mind of someone who's taking a sort of populist attitude to philosophy. I mean, I see similar things in physics, except they're not coming from people who are so treated with so much respect. I mean, from time to time, I get sent things by new theories of physics, which people send me by email, and and they claim that what they're doing is what they call qualitative physics. In other words, there's no mathematics in what they do, and I think what they're doing stands to proper physics, as what populist philosophers do stands to, as I would think of it, proper philosophy. But persuading people of that is sometimes impossible, unfortunately. So, I mean, of course, if you get into a debate with them and you actually start talking about a particular philosophical question, you can often show that what they're saying about it is based on fantastically oversimplified assumptions and so on. But I admit that I don't know of any as it were magic way of convincing populist philosophers that they're wrong, just as I think there's no magic way of convincing populist politicians that they're wrong, or of convincing their supporters that they're wrong. So now I'll turn to the questions that Li Zhongwei was asking, and the first of those was about the role of experimental philosophy in future philosophy, and whether it'll become, as it were, a major alternative to analytic philosophy. So I don't think it will, in part because its experimental methods are not really suited to answering philosophical questions. They're suited to answering questions about what non-philosophers think, or what people in general tend to think, or people in different cultures or different types of people think about various philosophical questions. But that kind of information doesn't tell us which answers to those philosophical questions are actually correct. So I think in that way it's not really able to be a major philosophical trend, because it's not providing answers to philosophical questions. I think also that its critique of the method of thought experiments and so on, I think that it seems to me is it's looking, the prospects for it succeeding are looking very small. So I don't think that people will stop doing what is called experimental philosophy, but I think it will increasingly become a part of cognitive science, that there'll be collaborative work involving both philosophers and psychologists. And I think that cognitive science does have some role to play in explaining how we come to philosophically relevant judgments and so on. I don't think it will be. It's not likely to be the kind of destructive role that was envisaged in the negative program. I think it's more likely, but it may, as it were, give us warnings about which kind of judgments are likely to be less reliable and so on. But I think those will have most credibility when they're not done as something that's specifically experimental philosophy. But I take it that in the long run, as cognitive science develops, we'll get more understanding of what kinds of cognitive biases and fallacies and so on human beings are prone to make, and these may cast light on the kind of judgments that we're taking for granted in philosophy, and I think they will help us to in some cases to take a more critical attitude to things that we're now treating as data. But I think that will be much more convincing when it's done as part of a general study of the human cognitive psychology, and rather than as part of a program with, as we say, with people who have an axe to grind against current philosophy. So I think, as I say, I think it will, in the long run, it will be absorbed into constructive interaction between philosophers and psychologists, which, of course, can properly be called cognitive science. The second question was about sort of virtual reality machines, and so one part of that was about, as it were, brains in vats and Plato's cave. Of course, it might be fun for students to be subjected to those things, but I'm not sure that there's really anything there that they couldn't do themselves just by using their imaginations, if they've got even a normal imaginative capacity. I mean, in particular, well, to imagine oneself being a brain in a vat is to imagine everything seeming, if it's a brain in a vat, which is where everything seems just as it currently does to me now, then I just have to, what I really have to imagine is not the thing, how things would seem to me then, because they would seem exactly as they do now. It's supposedly, it would be that I have to imagine that in fact, what I am is a brain in a vat. So the virtual reality machine wouldn't really do that. I mean, of course, you can show them a brain in a vat, which can have a very by the way, just a comment of very unexpected conclusions. I once watched a television program about consciousness with my daughter when she was about 3 years old, and they on the television they actually showed a brain in a vat, and I told her that she had one of those in her head, and she thought I was joking because the brain in a vat, to her, it looked like a fish swimming around in liquid, and so she thought I was telling her that she had a fish swimming about in her head. Yes. Anyway, so I think that in Plato's cave, of course, is a bit different, but I think. The actual amount of extra philosophical value one could get from having a computer simulation of Plato's cave would be very, very small. I think what does have more potential role in philosophy is computer simulation. the kind of computer simulation that would be relevant, for example, with something like with the model building methodology, where people like Brian Skirms have been interested in the evolution of norms, and then what we're interested in is some kind of iterative process of evolution, and to see whether it produces, let's say, some kind of equilibrium with something like norms when we start with different initial conditions. And for that kind of exercise, I think computer simulation is relevant in the way that it is with quite a bit of that sort of, as it were, speculative model building, or if you like, kind of factual model building. Then the third question was about whether we can get a bit more, as it were, scientific about the internal and external forces in acting in philosophy, and whether there's something like a law or logic in the history of philosophy. And I'm very skeptical about laws of history. For example, what economic law could have predicted the economic effects of COVID-19? So I doubt that that we should be expecting anything as in terms of universal generalizations or laws or something. I mean, I'm sure that there's more that we could say about their interaction, but I don't think it would take the form of universal generalizations. On boosting the imagination with like computational methods, I'm not sure exactly how that would work. Of course, some people do things like taking drugs to try to boost their imagination, but I'm not sure that the results are very interesting. On the kind of hybrid method that we might have, what I was suggesting was something relatively simple, which is that we investigate, this was in an earlier lecture, that we investigate various questions using different methods and seeing whether the different methods come to the same or similar conclusions, and that when they do, that makes our conclusions more robust. It would be interesting if there were ways of integrating them more fully, and perhaps there are, but as it were, but simply by using both methods and comparing the results, we're already getting some kind of extra robustness. And then finally, the question was the fifth question was about where are philosophical innovations going to come from? And it was mentioned that in the history of philosophy, there have been long periods where they came from outside universities. I think to some extent that was a reflection of the role of universities in the West at that time. That the universities were usually controlled by the church, and their job was producing, people like, clergymen to, members of the church and perhaps lawyers and so on. And so I think that given the way that universities were, it was not at all surprising that a lot of philosophical developments had to come from elsewhere. I think that that now, as long as we if we have philosophy departments which are interacting with other departments, I think I don't see why that there isn't enough scope there for innovation. And of course, it's if you're interacting, of course, people in outside philosophy departments and other departments have ideas about which of a kind of proto-philosophical kind. I mean, people in AI do, and so on. But I think that can be handled by interaction between philosophy departments and other departments. So we've got to keep those lines of communication open. But I think it's just, I mean, my experience is that people from other disciplines, they may have interesting things to say, but they don't really know how to develop them, and they're typically not aware of the problems with what they're saying, and they're not aware that actually they may be oscillating between 2 or 3 different ideas, which they're treating as a single approach. So, I don't at the moment really see that well-developed philosophical ideas are likely to come from outside the academic discipline of philosophy. But I hope that the academic discipline of philosophy is open to being inspired and provoked and so on by ideas from outside. But I think we then have, we are on the whole the people with the skills to develop those in an effective way. So thank you again for all your questions.